So Pam, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Hopefully one of the last of our virtual events, as we are eagerly anticipating a return to, next to normal in the next few months. So this event is about foreign policy and social justice, a topic that I know you feel passionately about. But given recent events, I was hoping we could start with your take on Ukraine. As a Foreign Service officer, you served at Embassy Moscow and in Warsaw, and I know this is really your area of expertise. So I'd love for you to kind of provide your thoughts, and I'll turn it over to you.
Rosalind, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me here today. You know, fireside chats are a great way to spread the word and to compare notes. And this is a great time to compare notes, because what's going on with Ukraine is a once in a generation event. I would make, as I try to sort it out myself, I put it into 3 buckets. The first bucket is to remind that this is the Hungary of 1956 and the Czechoslovakia of 1968 of our generation. Once again, the world is asking, to what degree will the Western world stand for and stand up for democratic values? And I'm afraid that much like in 56 and 68, and just for the record, I'm not old enough to know those things personally, but certainly we've all studied it. We will disappoint, and it's going to be heartbreaking to watch, because the dynamics at play suggest that, and the rhetoric going into it suggests that we are not willing to go toe-to-toe militarily with the Russians. And while the Ukrainians are doing very well against an overwhelming force, we know that it's just a matter of time before the Russians move out of their positions in the eastern and northern and southern parts of the country and take over as much of the country almost as they wish to. And remembering that that Putin has always said that his ambition is to reestablish the Russian Empire. He's not really made much bones about that. He's been more and more blatant about it recently, but this is a message that he's had for easily 15, 20 years now. So the first is, this is our moment, and undoubtedly we will disappoint. And the second point is that we're also showing the world what NATO is or is not. This entire conflict has been defined in terms of what NATO will or will not do. But it's interesting to contrast this with other conflicts that we've gotten involved in the last 15 years. That was not the rubric that we used, for instance, in Afghanistan. That was not the rubric we used in either of the Gulf Wars. That has not been the rubric that we've used in conjunction with the war on terror against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Those were frames where no, NATO was not willing to go in to lead the military campaigns in any of those instances, despite our invoking Article 5 in the Afghan context. But nevertheless, we believed that the cause was right, and we used our military force nevertheless. And we also came toe-to-toe with the Russians in a number of spaces in those conflicts. For instance, in Syria, we have been toe-to-toe and having to disentangle our militaries for the last 5 or 6 years. So fear of running up against Russia, or fear of suddenly triggering a much bigger conflict, despite the rhetoric that we're hearing from the Kremlin, is a much diminished threat. The United States and Russia are 2 countries that, if you take into account the Soviet Union, has spent more time figuring out how not to go to war with each other than any other 2 countries in the entire world. And that will continue to play out. But what we can say definitively is that we know that NATO is not a threat. We know that NATO is not a threat to Russia because it refuses to actually act when a core NATO interest is on the table. And so if you're thinking of this from the Russian perspective, in the first instance, you're getting Ukraine and you're discrediting Western democratic values at the same time. You are also discrediting NATO and everything around NATO, which is a handy trick as well, because NATO does it to itself. And then the last point I'd make, and this is my third framing, is we love our money. And that means that as hard as we are going after the Russians on the economic front right now, these sanctions, Russia has an amazing ability to withstand sanctions. This is easily the 6th or 7th time that we've imposed sanctions on Russia in the last 20, 25 years. And each time they figure out a way of sustaining themselves through it. They've endured enormous hardship. They talked about the interest rates in Russia rising to about 20% today. But I remember a time when we were there in the early 1990s, and a 20% interest rate would have been a gift. The interest rates were soaring well over 35, 40% on almost all money at the time. And they were changing currencies. They were, things were in chaos in their financial sector. So the Russians are willing to withstand an awful lot. And what they can count on, what Putin can count on from us, is that our stomach for depriving ourselves of the economic opportunity of being fully engaged with Russia is likely to waver in somewhere around 18 months from now. So they just have to stick it out. And along the way, they'll probably make a few oligarchs unhappy. But so Putin really gets a hat trick out of this: discrediting the West, discrediting NATO, getting Ukraine, and knowing that in the end, they're going to get their money back. So I am not terribly optimistic on this. And while I don't fault the Biden administration for the approach that they've taken, the Russians play a much longer game than any given US administration is capable of playing. And they're doing it again right now.
Wow.
Sober.
Okay. sobering for sure. Okay, well, maybe we can move on to the topic for tonight. So, you've retired from your career in foreign service, and now you're pursuing a legal career, and so furthering your social justice ideals. Can you talk about during your career in the foreign service, how did social justice play into that? And I just think back on recent events. You weren't serving during Black Lives Matter and during the whole kind of recent racial and social justice conversation we've been having in our society. But I think about how I spoke with friends living abroad about what was happening, and it was really difficult. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you framed those conversations and during your career, how you kind of thought about social justice and other kind of social domestic issues happening here in the States, and what that meant for kind of putting forward, towing the U.S. foreign policy line and advancing U.S. foreign policy abroad.
Right. So first, I'm going to play a trick with my video. So this is Pam as a second-year law student, been growing my hair, and that is Pam when I had to get up every day and be a member of the diplomatic corps. So it's after 30 years, I had a wonderful career, but I'm glad to be doing something else, and I'm glad to be out of the fairly straight strictures of the foreign policy career. That said, the whole time all of my assignments in the foreign policy, almost everyone required me at some point to be making decisions about how far I was willing to push my own social values, because I came to the Foreign Service. I came from a family with very strong social values, with very liberal values. And I always had to be making decisions about how far I thought the government should or shouldn't be going in a given foreign policy direction. I remember at one point when I was in Warsaw and we were working on missile defense negotiations with the Poles. And, you know, there's a point where I would come home at the end of the day and think to myself, I mean, should we really be doing this? Should we be putting missile defense capabilities into Europe? What does that mean? What we're essentially doing at a very broad level is we're enabling we're giving ourselves the ability and against the Iranians primarily to defeat and potentially, you know, kill lots of them in response to any attacks that would come out of Iran. And we're putting at the same time the Poles in a great deal of danger by taking these types of installations on their territory. But there were many points along the way where U.S. diplomats are asked to hold up the United States as a paradigm, as a city on a hill to which others might aspire. And I think the problem with that approach really hit home during the time when I was running the global coalition to defeat ISIS. For the last 3 years of my career, I was the director of the global coalition. And that was I ran the coalition on a day-to-day basis. I ran the civilian side of it. And what we had to face continuously is that there was always, in the propaganda that we saw coming out of ISIS, a grain of truth about who we were and about the way we treated, the way we othered people, the way that that we were not as big a tent as we said we were. We were not as democratic as we said we were, and we had not overcome our racist past in the way that we had said we had. And all of these things, the groups like the Islamic State and others that prey on individuals who feel othered in their society are given enormous opportunities when they're faced with things like the Trump administration, because they can point to not only the clear manifestation of the Black Lives Matter movement as, look, people really unhappy in the United States, but there's an even stronger undercurrent that they can point to. There's lots of people that can relate to the idea that their child is not being treated the same in school, or they're not being given the same opportunity as somebody in a job. And all of those things slowly eat away at their ability to feel part of their community. And eventually, if you feel so alienated from your community, it isn't crazy to think that you might kill a member of your community in the name of a group that does embrace you. And the Islamic State is just one extreme form of this, but we see it in all kinds of political movements as well. So it was always a little difficult to explain the United States, because you had to put a little bit of blinders on in order to often take the high road that we didn't deserve with some of our allies and our friends. And if you go to some place like South Africa, where I served towards the end of my career, they know us. They don't believe it. They will tell you to your face, you know, if you're a white South African, you'll say you abandoned us. And if you're a Black South African, you'll say you were pretty damn late to the party. And they were right on both counts. So, but many other people are less judgmental of us, although they probably should be a little bit more harsh. So you're constantly dealing with that externally. But then, Rosalind, I would also point out that internally, you always have to decide how far you're going to push, because in internal discussions, there's always options to push for paths where the United States doesn't necessarily have to take the front, where we can work with allies more closely and let others lead, where we can call on those that aren't traditional leaders, where the United States doesn't always have to stand out as some sort of exceptionalism. And that's how far you decide to push that is a personal choice. I did that quite a bit in my career to various effect, sometimes detrimental and sometimes okay.
Okay. So post Foreign Service, a few years ago, you decided to retire. Tell us about your decision, I guess to retire, but more importantly about your decision to pursue a law degree.
So the decision to retire was an easy one. I had gotten to the point where my choices were narrow, that logically I would go out, my next assignment would be go out potentially as an ambassador. And the path to becoming an ambassador means you have to become close to the White House. And then when you're done with that, you have to actually represent the positions of the White House. And this was during the Trump administration. So both of those were predicates that weren't going to fly with me. So having made a decision to leave, I spent about a year trying to figure out what I would do next, still feeling like there was another chapter out there. And also not wanting to stay in the foreign policy space, to be honest, wanting to come home. And so I traveled around the country. I was out in Arizona looking at the border to see how we were handling that situation. I went down to Puerto Rico. I traveled to Israel to take a look at some of the things going on in the West Bank and Gaza there. And when I got finished with all of that, I came to two conclusions. The first was that while a retired person can absolutely fulfill themselves being that oh so steady volunteer for any one of a number of organizations, that wasn't going to be enough for me. And in fact, in order to achieve what I wanted to do, I needed to go to law school. And then the second is that all these years, and I was alluding, I think, to this in the previous question, all these years I've been out representing the United States, there are so many times when I had to admit that the United States I was representing to other people just almost doesn't exist. That in fact, at home, we are still a very deeply divided country. We are a country that's not come to grips with its past. And so I became convinced that what I needed to do is what I refer to as homework, rather than work abroad. I needed to be working at home, and working at home meant moving into the social justice space. And so that became my goal. I studied, I set little traps for myself. I'll take the LSAT, but if I don't get a good score, then I won't apply to law schools. Well, I got an okay score on the LSAT. And then I said, well, maybe I won't get into any law schools, and then I won't have to go to law school. But in fact, I got into Howard, which is where I'm going. And it's an incredible experience. And I think it's setting me up for the kind of career I can really find my passion in going forward. It goes without saying, I assume, for everybody on this call, that when you choose to do something with, whether or not it's 40 hours, 60 hours, 80 hours of your week, for God's sakes, do something that you actually care about, because there's so many things that you are forced, especially as a woman, to compromise on in order to make that career work, that you better be sure that you're enjoying what it is that you're doing, and that you get up in the morning with a sense of enthusiasm. I can count on my hand 5 days in 32 years with the Foreign Service where I was bored, or I didn't know what I was going to do that day, or I wasn't excited about the day. And I can almost recall each one of those days individually, because being bored was almost never happened. So looking ahead, I take the same attitude towards law school. It's a hell of a book club, so to speak. But I wake up books. Every day. Yeah, but I wake up every day and I want to read the books, and I want to go to class, and I want to ask the questions, and I want to meet my classmates. And I just came from a discussion about KBJ. If you don't know, if you haven't got KBJ in
Oh,
your
yes.
head, just like RBG,
Yeah.
you should have
Yeah.
KBJ in your head, because Ketanji Brown Jackson is going to be a fantastic Supreme Court justice. Mm-hmm. She brings such an incredible array of skills and background to it, and as the first honest to God public defender on the court, will make such a difference. Such a difference.
Yeah. So Amy, you know, in terms of day to day, you're a 2L, which means second year of law school.
Half baked.
And you know, how is your time, you know, in the Foreign Service and your experience abroad, you know, informed, and does that come into your classes and the discussions that you have in law school?
Oh, well, one, going to school is just like going to a job. I mean, you have to approach law school like you have to approach a job. I get up in the morning. I get up about 4 o'clock in the morning and start my reading, and I finish my day at 5 o'clock. And after that, you know, I spend time with my husband, because you should pay attention to those relationships so they last. And then I rest and get myself back into bed at a reasonable time. So the schedule for me, and in there I've got classes and other things that happen, but the schedule for me is just like a work day. It's just that instead of going to meetings, which I used to do a lot of going to meetings and holding meetings and all that kind of stuff, now I go to classes and participate in class discussions and try to advance my own brain while I'm doing it. I'm sure, however, my professors are wondering, what is that white woman going to say again in our class? But I'm trying not to make it too crazy. But you know, my Foreign Service career has come in funny ways. I mean, every once in a while, people actually ask me about things having to do with foreign policy, in which case that's an easy answer. But more importantly, I think it's just a reminder that the United States is an incredibly diverse place itself. So as you start to start working with different communities and start investing in the law, you have to also invest in understanding the people that you are working with. Like, one of the things that I did this past fall was work in our movement lawyering clinic. And our movement lawyering clinic is a very different way of having lawyers work with groundswell movements. The traditional civil rights leaders would lead the movements as well as lead the lawyering. But these days, the most effective movements, and the clinic that I belong to, the head of our clinic, Justin Hansford, Professor Justin Hansford, is a lawyer for the Black Lives Matter movement. And being the lawyer for a movement means that you're there to empower and facilitate them, not to tell them what to do and not to guide them and not to put them in a straitjacket to say that this is the legislation that we're going to pursue, and as a result, this is what you need to do to support it. It's the opposite way around. We look at what the needs of the movement are, and then we adjust to it. And those are all things they're just like going to, you know, just the same kind of skills that you have when you go to a foreign country. You learn the people, you learn the language, you learn what's important to them, you learn what they celebrate and what they grieve about and what makes them tick. And then hopefully you try to mesh what you're trying to bring to the table with what their needs are, so that, you know, everybody walks away going, oh, that was great. There was something bigger happened that would have happened otherwise. But the law is not just about winning the case in the Supreme Court. In fact, in the future, it's probably less and less about trying to win a case in the Supreme Court, more about making sure that localities and state legislatures and others get it right, so that we continue to be able to thrive as a democracy and as a people.
Mm-hmm. So what's next for you as you're rounding out? You're about midway through your law degree.
This is the point where
what are you planning on doing next?
Yeah, no. This is the point where law students are supposed to be able to start saying, well, what are you going to do when you're done? And on the one hand, I'm like, well, like any law student, I know what I want to do. I want to do appellate work. But unlike other law students, my path towards this, just because of my age and my experience, is a little different. Like yesterday, I applied for clerkships for a bunch of different courses. I had my very first internship this past summer, which was a blast. Never, truth be told, I'm old enough that there were no internships. If you wanted a summer job, you just got a summer job. No one called it an internship. You had a job, you got paid a little bit of money or no money or very little money, but no one structured it that way. It was the experience that you needed. So looking ahead, it's all about, it's all about trying to figure out how to take all this law and do something good with it. I'm starting with capital punishment because I think it stands for itself that if our system of justice around those we choose to kill as a state is not just, then it stands to reason that every other crime which we treat with less seriousness than capital crimes is also unjust. And conversely, if we can inject justice into decisions about who lives and who dies, then maybe we can also inject more justice into the system as a whole. So that's it's the steep hill. You start with a steep hill and then you go to one slightly less steep. So that's where I'm focused right now.
All right.
Capital.
I'm kind of have my last question on my list here, but before I ask that, I'll just invite participants to put questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them. So, what advice do you have for aspiring foreign service officers, but also aspiring lawyers, and it's also maybe finally aspiring people who want to be active in social justice in a productive way? Okay,
so we haven't really talked about women. So women service officers, all right, or women lawyers, but let's start with women foreign service officers, or people that are involved in the foreign affairs community, because it can take a lot of different forms. When I started, there were really probably only 3 different paths you could take that would take you abroad consistently. One would be the Foreign Service, or a foreign service agency like USAID or Foreign Agricultural Service or Commercial Service. Or you could work for a corporation, or there were a few jobs in the nonprofit sector abroad with really big nonprofits. But that was generally the range, and I'm including Peace Corps in the first group because it's a government sponsored, government undertaking. But nowadays it's just a lot more. There are a lot more options out there for people. The nonprofit sector has exploded in its activity, and the corporate sector it's not just the biggest corporations that are out there. They're like 1 million different smaller corporations that have found happy seats abroad too. So there's a lot more choice out there. However, I would say that for women, I think there's always a challenge in choosing your career abroad, because if you also want companionship and family, you usually have to spend a little bit of time finding somebody who is willing to also go abroad with you. Not a little bit more complicated than deciding what state to live in the United States. And in addition, especially if you're on a career path, whether or not it's in any one of those 3 channels, government, for-profit or not-for-profit, somebody has to lead and somebody has to follow. Someone's going to follow somebody else around. It's a rare couple that can both find equally fulfilling jobs in a foreign country. It's rare that you can find it sometimes even in the same US metropolitan area, but when you add foreign component, it gets harder. And so those things absolutely make it more difficult. And then when you're actually abroad and you start doing things like trying to raise family, we raised our family abroad. You always have to take into consideration whether or not, you know, your kids are foreign or kids that like being raised abroad. I mean, Rosalind knows my children. They are lovely, wonderful young adults, young women now in their 20s. One of them loved being abroad and saw it as one big kind of camp adventure. And the other one was just like, is this another bedroom, another house, another country, another language? I have to learn all these things all over again. And so perhaps didn't appreciate it. She does in hindsight, but at the time didn't appreciate it quite as much as she might have. So you have to balance. There's a lot more balancing when I think there's a lot more on your shoulders when you're a woman trying to do a foreign service. And I'm sorry, I didn't mention journalism. Journalism, of course, is a really, really rich foreign experience. And I hope people are taking up that call because it's more important than ever. Although foreign journalism has changed a lot, there are so many more stringer journalists hired from local communities now, even for major news outlets than there used to be. It used to be foreign correspondents were pretty much the only way we got our news in the United States, but not any longer. So it's a little more complicated. Nevertheless, those are important things to remember as you're trying to figure out how to put it together. Lawyering, I don't really know. All I know is that it seems like the lawyers talk a lot about stress. There's a lot of talk about stress. I see articles about alcoholism and stress. And for those that work in public interest law, which is where I'm going, there's a lot of stress because just like social workers and teachers and other people that are on the front line of large numbers of the public, lawyers can take on a lot of the stress that comes from their clients' lives because people don't come to lawyers when they're happy. People come to lawyers when something has gone wrong, and often at the worst possible moment in their lives. Mm-hmm. And so I'm watching this field, recognizing that I'm not new to stress. I am new to this kind of stress and trying to figure out how to. I'm watching how they recommend we navigate it. There's lots of breathing exercises and other things. But I just tell my colleagues, know when you stop every day. Know there is a time when you stop and where you can spend some time for yourself. And that goes for whether or not you're in law school or doing something else. Every day there needs to be a time when you are no longer doing the thing that maybe gives you joy, but gives you a lot of stress too.
Yeah. All right. Sound advice. Do you want to conclude with social advice for, social justice generally? Because I know that, at least from my perspective, it's a systemic issue. It just is. And so as you're kind of in yourself, trying to figure out how to, deal with the issues at hand in our society. How do you as an individual kind of figure out where you can be helpful and productive?
Yeah, no, and I see Erica's question as well in the chat. So
yep.
I'm gonna wrap these two things in together because I think one, I think we have to recognize the moment that we're in right now. There are cycles of social justice. The 1960s was an incredibly strong cycle of social justice, but it was over by about 1968. And then you can look at the period after that as the reaction to that. A lot of that is a reaction to that social justice movement. It was a huge, we're still getting, I think, in Trumpism, the tail end of that backlash of people who felt empowered and suddenly felt like their power was diminished by the fact that another community was being empowered. And we're again at the precipice of being able to have huge breakthroughs if we keep our courage and push forward. And I think, Erica, to answer your question, that an honest America, honest about its history, honest about its failings, and at the same time recognizing the hope of, in particular, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, is something that can continue to inspire, because every country in its own way that is trying to move up the ladder of democracy and social justice is having to come to grips with some inequity within their system. And if we can not only pattern instead of setting ourselves up as the beacon to which everybody should come to because we're already there, but rather showing people what the path to the beacon looks like, I think we're doing both ourselves and we're doing the world a really, really good, turn.
Yeah.
I've had so many great counter ISIL interns. I can't believe you're on tonight. Good to see you.
Well, thank you so much, Pam. That was a wonderful note to end it on. So unless there are any other questions that folks want to hit enter on right now, I think we can probably wrap it up.
And don't ever let yourself be bored. You know, today was about Terry stops. Tomorrow will be about something else. So yeah. Anyway, I'm so pleased to have been here. Thank you very much, Rosalind and Shaz, for inviting me, and really best of luck to all of you.
Thank you
very much. Thank you.
Good night.
All right. Good night.